what was that process like for you, breaking out of the addiction?
Yeah, so the signs were there for a long time. I started looking at pornography at 13, and it starts out so innocent. It was in the backyard of one of the neighborhood boys who stole his father's magazine, but it creates an emotional experience for you. And so when you're a confused 11-year-old that's already starting to feel not good enough, it's respite. There's a break, right? And so you start looking for those breaks, and you start needing those breaks from yourself and from your pain and from the psychology that you've adopted from your parents, and that suffering experience. And then, as I got older, I had access to more. So, at 18, 19 years old, I went away to college and no one's watching me. So, you start drinking. And I wasn't an alcoholic, but I was using alcohol to check out. And then I got exposed to marijuana. And then that really became a trifecta for me. There's so much fascinating research and science that's coming out around addiction. And one of the things I'm really grateful for that I've only really recently started talking about, because I mentioned it once on stage and literally, a dozen men came up to me afterwards, was my struggle with sex addiction and pornography. And the interesting thing about that is a lot of the research says that the release of neurochemicals that around pornography is second only to something like crystal meth and methamphetamines. Like, it's a very strong emotional reaction. And so it creates very deep bonds, right, within the neural networks of your brain. And I was using drugs and alcohol to get to that high. And so as I've gotten on the other side of it, I realized, like, I didn't have so much a drug problem or an alcohol problem. Those were gateways to the intense emotional experience of sexual gratification. And so the realization that I had that my life had become unmanageable. So I'll speak to that first. Like, when did I realize it? I had glimpses of it. I had hunches of it. People from the outside looking in knew I had a problem. I mean, I had raised over $4 million for a venture-backed technology company back in 2004. I was considered an expert in the search engine optimization field when it was very, very early on. I was running a team of 30 people, but I was chaotic. And in 2009, I had an experience where I had tried to manage my drug and alcohol use for probably over a year. I wouldn't drink at all, and then I'd go out on this thing we had called Wind Down Wednesdays, and I'd just have a blowout Wednesday night after not drinking for a month. I'd swear I'd never smoke pot again. And I was in one of those swearing I'd never smoke marijuana again. And a lot of people smoke marijuana, and we have the legalization of marijuana. And marijuana is incredibly dangerous in the sense that how can I say this? It arrests your nervous system. It sequesters your nervous system, and it does it so slowly that you aren't really aware of it. And so I had been smoking for over a decade. I didn't realize at the time how much it had cut me off from spirit and intuition and creativity. It was creating a false sense of creativity, but I knew I couldn't stop. So I swore this was the last time I was going to order pot from my pot dealer. And I did. I just wanted one more joint. And he shows up at my house, delivers the pot. I end up rolling the joint and I smoke it. And then all of a sudden, after the initial high, I felt the tremendous guilt and shame of the fact that, like, I said I was never going to smoke again. Here I am doing it again. How many times is this going to happen? So I took the bag of marijuana and I filled it up. I put it in the microwave. I filled it up with water. That's the first thing that I did, so that I couldn't smoke it. And I drove it over to a local grocery store and went in back of the grocery store and threw it in one of those, big blue bins in the back where they throw all the garbage. And I came home, and then when the high wore off 3 hours later, I got back into my car, drove over to the blue garbage bin, crawled into it, grabbed and found the bag of marijuana, and then came home and dried it out and smoked another joint. And so, like, that was the moment where I was like, wow, I've got a major problem. Like, I cannot control myself. And so that's when I decided to start working a 12-step program. And at first I went into Alcoholics Anonymous, but I just didn't resonate with it. Like alcohol wasn't really my problem. Then I started going to Narcotics Anonymous meetings, and I didn't really connect with that experience, not knowing really at the time that drugs wasn't really my problem. And then someone recommended a Sex Addicts Anonymous meeting. And that just sounded creepy. It was like something I didn't want to have to deal with or admit. And I went into the room, and it was very different, like no judgment, but it was very different than the AA and NA meetings I went to, where you had people who were physically burned out, right? I mean, they had just destroyed themselves with drugs and alcohol physically. And I went into this SAA meeting, and it was a bunch of successful professionals. Like you couldn't tell looking at anyone that they had an addiction problem. And I started listening to what people were saying in terms of what they experienced in their day and how they were emotionally processing it. And I realized over time that this was like a room full of Jedi Knights. Because as my sponsor said, you know, like you can not go to the store and buy alcohol, and you can not call your drug dealer to deliver drugs. But when you're struggling with sex addiction, you're walking around with, he says, the pipe between your legs. There's nowhere to go. You can't get away from the drug. And so that program, which took me about 18 months to get any kind of sobriety under my belt, was really a game changer in terms of the development of my self-awareness. Because in order to get clean and sober, I couldn't just stay away from the substance. I had to start to see my mind in advance of the action that it was compelling me to take. And so it was a whole series of, it's called your bottom line, right? You set these boundaries for yourself. And I would violate my bottom line, and I'd work with my sponsor, and he'd say, like, what was the thinking before that? And I'd just catch the thinking earlier and earlier and earlier and earlier. And so as a result, I started becoming really self-aware. And so I'm super grateful for that experience. But then I got stuck in 12-step. Like I wanted to go beyond the rooms and beyond sort of this idea of I'm just maintaining my life of sobriety. I was like, no, I want to go create some extraordinary things. And that was the doorway getting into this thing called personal development.